Ferdinand de Saussure. How does language create meaning? Ferdinand de Saussure was born in Geneva in 1857. A brilliant linguist from a young age, he studied in Leipzig and Paris before returning to Geneva. His most influential work, Course in General Linguistics, was published posthumously in 1916 based on his students' lecture notes. Saussure was frustrated with the historical focus of 19th-century linguistics, which prioritized tracing the evolution of words. Instead, he sought to understand language as a systematic structure of relationships. This shift from a diachronic, historical, focus to a synchronic, structural, one laid the foundation for modern linguistics and the broader movement of structuralism, fundamentally changing how we approach the study of human culture. Language is not a collection of labels for pre-existing things but a system of signs. Each sign is composed of two inseparable elements, the signifier, which is the sound image or mental imprint of a sound, and the signified, which is the concept it represents. The relationship between these two is fundamentally arbitrary. There is no natural or inherent reason why the sound image tree should represent the concept of a leafy plant. This arbitrariness means that meaning is not derived from a world that already exists. Instead, the structure of our language actively shapes how we categorize and perceive reality. By focusing on the internal relationship within the sign, we move away from the idea of language as a transparent window onto the world and begin to see it as a complex, self-contained system of values. To study language scientifically, Saussure argued it is necessary to distinguish between the abstract system and its individual instances. Langue represents the collective, social system of rules and conventions that makes speech possible, the shared grammar and vocabulary that exists independently of any single speaker. In contrast, parole refers to the actual acts of speaking or writing performed by individuals in specific contexts. While parole is diverse and unpredictable, langue is stable and structured. Focusing on langue allows us to analyze the underlying patterns that govern communication rather than the fleeting noise of everyday talk. This distinction emphasizes that individuals do not create language, they inherit a system that precedes them. Understanding language as a social institution means recognizing that our ability to mean anything at all depends on our participation in a pre-established structure. This insight shifted the focus of human sciences from individual psychology to the social and systemic forces that enable and constrain human agency. Traditional linguistics was primarily concerned with the historical evolution of languages over time, an approach termed diachronic. However, understanding how a language functions at any given moment requires a synchronic perspective, which analyzes the system as a static whole. Imagine a game of chess. To understand the state of the board, you do not need to know the history of every move that led to that point. You only need to understand the current positions of the pieces and the rules that govern their relationships. Similarly, speakers of a language do not need to know the etymology of words to communicate effectively. They operate within a synchronic system where meaning is determined by the contemporary network of differences. By prioritizing the synchronic over the diachronic, we can uncover the structural logic that remains hidden when we focus solely on historical change. This methodological shift allowed for the rigorous analysis of cultural systems beyond language, such as kinship and myth, suggesting that a system's functionality depends on its internal relational logic in the present moment. Saussure's work provided the blueprint for structuralism, which dominated French intellectual life in the mid-20th century. His emphasis on the relational nature of meaning influenced a wide range of disciplines, from anthropology and psychoanalysis to literary theory and sociology. By demonstrating that meaning is generated through systems of difference, he paved the way for thinkers like Claude Lévi-Strauss and Roland Barthes to analyze culture as a text composed of signs. Furthermore, his concept of the arbitrary sign challenged the traditional view of truth as a correspondence between words and things, a critique that was later radicalized by post-structuralists like Jacques Derrida. Saussure's legacy lies in the recognition that human reality is mediated through linguistic and symbolic structures. His insights continue to inform contemporary debates about the social construction of identity and the limits of representation, marking a pivotal shift from the historical subject to the structural systems that define our world. Claude Lévi-Strauss. Is there a universal logic to culture? Claude Lévi-Strauss was born in 1908 and is regarded as the father of modern structural anthropology. His formative years were spent conducting fieldwork in the Brazilian Amazon, experiences he later chronicled in his famous memoir, Tristes Tropiques. This encounter with indigenous cultures led him to reject the Eurocentric idea of primitive minds, instead arguing that all human thought follows universal structural patterns. In his landmark work, Structural Anthropology, he applied linguistic models to the study of kinship and myth. Throughout his long career, he sought to uncover the savage mind that operates beneath the surface of diverse cultural practices, aiming to find the common cognitive architecture shared by all humanity. The study of kinship was traditionally focused on the biological or functional aspects of family ties. However, applying structural linguistics to social life reveals that kinship is actually a system of communication. Just as words gain value only through their relationships within a language, individuals in a society are defined by their positions in a network of symbolic exchanges. The most fundamental rule in this system is the prohibition of incest, which forces families to look outside their own group for marriage partners. This elementary structure of kinship creates a web of alliances, most fundamentally through the exchange of women between groups, that binds society together, ensuring social cohesion. By viewing marriage as a form of symbolic exchange, we can see how societies are built on a logic of reciprocity. This shift in perspective moves away from the specific content of customs and focuses instead on the underlying rules that govern social relationships, suggesting that culture is a structured system of symbolic logic that precedes and shapes individual behavior. Myths often appear chaotic, but a structural analysis reveals they are highly organized. Myths are composed of small units called mythemes, which function like phonemes in a language. The meaning of a myth does not reside in a single story but in the way these units are combined and contrasted. At the heart of most myths are binary oppositions, fundamental contradictions like nature versus culture, life versus death, or raw versus cooked. The myth acts as a logical tool to mediate these tensions, attempting to resolve the contradictions humans face in their daily lives. By comparing different versions of myths across various cultures, we can see that while characters and settings change, the underlying structure of oppositions remains remarkably consistent. This approach suggests that the human mind has a universal tendency to categorize the world through dualistic structures. Instead of asking what a myth means literally, we should look at how it functions as a mental map, helping people navigate existence through a structured system of symbolic logic. The way humans create meaning can be understood through the concept of bricolage. A bricoleur is a handyman who uses whatever tools and materials are at hand to solve a problem, rather than following a pre-planned engineering design. This is how the savage mind operates when constructing myths or cultural systems. It takes remnants of past events, stories, and images, intellectual debris, and rearranges them into new patterns. Unlike the engineer who creates new tools for a specific purpose, the bricoleur works within a finite set of symbols to express a wide range of ideas. This concept challenges the Western idea of progress and the perceived superiority of scientific thought. It suggests that mythical thought is not a failed attempt at science, but a sophisticated way of organizing the world using a different kind of logic. By recognizing the creative nature of bricolage, we can appreciate how diverse cultures construct meaningful lives out of the materials available to them, emphasizing that human creativity is always situated within a structured system of inherited symbols. Lévi-Strauss revolutionized the social sciences by introducing the structural method, which sought universal laws behind cultural diversity. His work directly inspired the structuralist movement in France, influencing thinkers like Jacques Lacan, Michel Foucault, and Louis Althusser. By demonstrating that cultural phenomena could be analyzed with the same rigor as language, he elevated anthropology to a leading discipline. However, his emphasis on static, universal structures eventually sparked a reaction from post-structuralists who criticized his neglect of history and individual agency. Jacques Derrida's famous critique of Lévi-Strauss helped launch deconstruction, arguing that the center of a structure is itself a construct. Despite these critiques, Lévi-Strauss's legacy remains profound. He fundamentally changed how we understand the relationship between nature and culture, and his defense of the intellectual complexity of non-Western societies paved the way for modern multiculturalism. Jacques Lacan. How does language construct the subject? Jacques Lacan was a French psychoanalyst who famously called for a return to Freud. Born in 1901, he became a controversial figure due to his unconventional teaching methods and complex theories. His major writings are collected in Eckrats, and his long-running public seminars attracted the leading intellectuals of his day. Lacan reinterpreted Freud through the lens of structural linguistics, famously stating that the unconscious is structured like a language. He moved away from the biological focus of traditional psychoanalysis, instead exploring how the human subject is constructed through language, desire, and the gaze of others. The development of a coherent sense of self begins with a formative experience in early childhood, the mirror stage. When an infant recognizes their own image in a mirror, they experience a mixture of jubilation and alienation. Before this point, the child perceives themselves as a fragmented collection of sensations. The mirror image provides a fictional sense of wholeness and mastery that the child does not yet possess. This ideal I becomes the basis for the ego, but it is fundamentally an illusion. The child identifies with an image that is outside themselves, leading to a permanent state of alienation. This suggests that the self is not an internal essence but a construct built on an external representation. The ego is formed through a process of meconnaissance, misrecognition, as we strive to coincide with an idealized image we can never truly become. This concept challenges the idea of a stable, autonomous individual, suggesting instead that our identity is always mediated by an external gaze and the symbolic order. To understand human experience, Lacan distinguished between three interlocking registers: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. The imaginary is the realm of images, identifications, and the illusions of the self, rooted in the mirror stage. The symbolic is the domain of language, social laws, and the cultural order that precedes the individual. Entry into the symbolic is necessary for becoming a social subject, though it requires the repression of primal desires. Finally, the real is that which escapes both language and imagery. It is the raw, unmediated experience that cannot be symbolized. The real is often experienced as a traumatic gap or a limit to our understanding. Our reality is constructed through the interaction of these three realms. We live primarily in the symbolic and imaginary, using language and images to make sense of a world that is fundamentally grounded in the elusive real. This framework allows us to see how our desires and identities are shaped by social structures while acknowledging the presence of something that resists total symbolization. Desire is not about finding a specific object that will provide satisfaction, but about the persistent lack that keeps us searching. The objet petit is the name for the object cause of desire. It is not the thing we think we want, but the elusive remnant or small other that represents the lost part of ourselves that we can never recover upon entering the symbolic order. Because our entry into language involves a fundamental loss, we are left with a permanent hole in our being. We spend our lives chasing various objects, money, fame, or romantic partners, believing they will make us whole. However, these are merely substitutes for the objet petit, which remains forever out of reach. Each time we attain a goal, the lack persists, driving us toward the next object. This cycle reveals that desire is self-sustaining and fundamentally insatiable. Understanding the objet petit helps us recognize that our search for meaning is driven by a structural impossibility rather than a personal failure to find happiness. Lacan's reinterpretation of psychoanalysis had a massive impact on fields beyond clinical practice. His theories became central to feminist criticism, as thinkers like Lucy Irigaray and Julia Kristeva engaged with his ideas about the phallus and the symbolic order. In film studies, his concepts of the gaze and the mirror stage provided tools for analyzing how cinema constructs the spectator's identity. Slavoj Žižek famously applied Lacanian concepts to political theory, demonstrating their continued relevance. Lacan's influence also extended to post-structuralism, where his emphasis on the fragmented subject resonance with the work of Foucault and Derrida. While his writing is notoriously difficult, his insights into the role of desire and the symbolic nature of identity have become indispensable for modern critical thought, bridging the gap between psychoanalysis and the broader humanities. Louis Althusser. How does ideology maintain state power? Louis Althusser was a leading French Marxist philosopher born in 1918. He taught for many years at the École Normale Supérieure, where he mentored a generation of influential thinkers. In works such as For Marx and Reading Capital, he sought to strip Marxism of its Hegelian and humanist interpretations, proposing a symptomatic reading of Marx's texts. His goal was to establish Marxism as a rigorous science of history rather than a moral philosophy. Althusser's life was marked by personal tragedy and severe mental illness, yet his structuralist approach to ideology and the state transformed Marxist theory, providing new ways to understand how capitalist societies reproduce themselves. Maintaining the dominance of the ruling class requires more than just physical force. While the repressive state apparatus, RSA, such as the police and military, handles direct coercion, the state also relies on ideological state apparatuses, ISAs, to ensure stability. These include institutions like the church, the family, and the media. Most significantly, Althusser argued that in modern capitalist societies, the education system has replaced the church as the dominant ISA. Unlike the centralized RSA, ISAs are often private or semi-autonomous, yet they function to instill the values necessary for the reproduction of the social order. Through these institutions, individuals are taught to accept their place in the hierarchy and view the capitalist system as natural. This concept shifts political analysis from the state as a single instrument of power to a complex network of social practices, suggesting that power is woven into the fabric of everyday life. Ideology does not simply exist as abstract ideas, it functions by transforming individuals into subjects. This process is known as interpellation or hailing. Imagine a police officer calling out, "Hey, you there." When you turn around, you recognize that the call is addressed to you, and in that moment, you become a subject of the law. Ideology works similarly, constantly addressing us through cultural and social institutions. We are hailed as citizens, consumers, or students, and by responding, we adopt the identities society expects of us. This means our sense of self is not something that exists prior to society, but is produced through ideological practices. We are always already subjects, as the names and roles waiting for us are defined by the social structure before we are even born. This insight challenges the liberal idea of the autonomous individual, suggesting instead that our subjectivity is a product of the structures we inhabit. Simple cause-and-effect models are often insufficient to explain historical change. Borrowing from psychoanalysis, the concept of overdetermination suggests that any given social event is the result of multiple, overlapping causes rather than a single economic factor. While the economy might be the determinant in the last instance, it does not act alone. Political, ideological, and cultural forces all interact in a complex, non-linear way to produce a specific historical moment. For example, a revolution is not just the result of economic hardship, it requires a unique combination of political crisis, ideological shifts, and international pressures. This perspective rejects a simple base and superstructure model where the economy directly dictates every aspect of culture. Instead, it views society as a decentered structure where different levels of practice have relative autonomy. Using the lens of overdetermination, we can analyze the specific conditions that make change possible, recognizing that history is a complex interplay of diverse forces. Althusser's structural Marxism had a profound impact on political theory and cultural studies. His work moved Marxist analysis away from economic determinism, allowing for a more sophisticated study of culture and media. His concept of the ISA became a cornerstone for thinkers like Stuart Hall and the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies. Furthermore, his theory of interpellation influenced feminist and post-colonial theorists in analyzing how identity is constructed through power relations. Even though his reputation suffered due to personal controversies, his methodological innovations continue to be felt. The Althusserian shift toward a structural understanding of ideology paved the way for post-structuralism and the work of Michel Foucault, forcing a radical rethinking of the relationship between the individual, society, and power. Roland Barthes. How do signs naturalize social values? Roland Barthes was a French literary theorist, semiotician, and philosopher born in 1915. He was a central figure in structuralism and post-structuralism, known for his elegant prose and insightful analyses of everyday culture. His early work, Mythologies, examined the hidden meanings in modern life, while his later career challenged traditional notions of authorship in his famous essay, The Death of the Author. Barthes was fascinated by how meaning is produced through signs and codes, and his work shifted from a rigorous structural analysis of texts to a more playful, open-ended exploration of the reader's experience. He remained a prolific and influential writer until his death in 1980. To understand how culture communicates, we must look at the different levels of meaning in signs. At the basic level, denotation is the literal meaning. For example, a picture of a red rose represents a flower. However, signs also carry connotations, the cultural or ideological associations that go beyond the literal. That same rose can signify romance or passion. Barthes argued that in everyday life, these connotations often function to turn culture into nature. We take media messages for granted, failing to recognize the social values being communicated. By analyzing the mythologies of modern society, we can uncover how dominant ideologies are subtly reinforced through seemingly innocent images. This approach reveals that nothing is natural in the world of human signs, everything is a product of social convention. Understanding the interplay between denotation and connotation allows us to become critical consumers of culture, recognizing the power structures that shape our perceptions of reality. The traditional way of reading often involves searching for the true meaning intended by the author. However, this approach grants the author too much authority. By declaring the death of the author, Barthes shifted the focus to the language of the text itself. A text is not a message from one person to another, but a multi-dimensional space where various writings, none of them original, blend and clash. The author is merely a scripter who assembles pre-existing codes and cultural references. The true site where the meaning of a text is unified is not its origin, the author, but its destination, the reader. This shift empowers the reader to become an active participant in the creation of meaning. It suggests that a text has no single, final meaning, but is open to an infinite number of interpretations. By removing the author from the center, we open up new possibilities for understanding how language operates independently of individual control. Not all texts invite the same level of engagement. Some works, readerly, leesable texts, are designed for easy consumption. They follow established conventions and present a clear meaning that the reader simply receives, reinforcing the reader's existing view of the world. In contrast, writerly, scriptable texts challenge and unsettle the reader. Often fragmented or experimental, they force the reader to work to produce their own meaning. A writerly text turns the reader into a co-producer of the work, making them aware of the very process of making sense. This distinction highlights a preference for literature that resists easy consumption and encourages active, critical engagement. It suggests that the most valuable cultural experiences are those that disrupt our comfortable habits and force us to confront the complexity of language. By seeking out writerly texts, we can move beyond the pleasure of recognition and experience the bliss of a radical encounter with the unknown. Barthes's influence on literary criticism and cultural studies is immeasurable. His application of semiotics to popular culture laid the groundwork for media studies, inspiring scholars to analyze fashion and advertisements as systems of signs. The death of the author became a founding document of post-structuralism, influencing Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault in their efforts to decenter the human subject. Furthermore, his later focus on the pleasure of the text paved the way for reader response theory and queer theory. Barthes's ability to move between rigorous structuralism and a more personal, poetic style made him a unique figure. He taught us that the world is a forest of signs waiting to be decoded, and that the act of reading is a creative and potentially subversive act. Hans-Georg Gadamer. Can we ever escape our historical bias? Hans-Georg Gadamer was a preeminent German philosopher born in 1900. A student of Martin Heidegger, he developed philosophical hermeneutics, the study of interpretation and understanding. His magnum opus, Truth and Method, 1960, challenged the dominance of scientific method in the humanities, arguing that truth is something experienced through dialogue and tradition rather than through objective detachment. Gadamer lived through the turbulent history of 20th-century Germany, informing his belief in the importance of historical consciousness and open conversation. He remained a respected figure in global philosophy until his death at the age of 102. Understanding is not just a method used in the humanities, it is the fundamental way we exist in the world. Traditionally, hermeneutics was seen as a set of rules for interpreting texts, but Gadamer transformed it into a philosophical inquiry into the nature of understanding itself. He argued that we never approach a text with a blank slate, instead, we always bring prejudices or pre-understandings rooted in our historical context. Far from being obstacles, these prejudices are the very conditions that make understanding possible, providing the initial framework for engagement. This perspective shifts the focus from finding an objective meaning to recognizing understanding as an ongoing, productive event. We do not simply recover a past meaning, we participate in a process where the past and present interact. Every act of interpretation is also an act of application, as we relate what we learn to our own contemporary situation. When we engage with a text from the past or a person from a different culture, we encounter a horizon different from our own. A horizon represents the range of vision possible from a particular vantage point. Understanding occurs through a fusion of horizons, Horizonverschmelzung, where our own perspective and that of the other are brought into dialogue. This is not about one side winning, but about creating a new, broader horizon that encompasses both. In this process, our own pre-understandings are tested. We must be open to being told something, which requires a willingness to put our certainties at risk. This dialogical model emphasizes that truth is not something we possess, but something that happens to us in the encounter. It suggests that we can never achieve a final understanding, as every fusion of horizons opens new questions, embracing an inclusive and meaningful conversation with the world. We are always situated within a tradition that shapes our thinking, a concept Gadamer called effective historical consciousness, Wirkungsgeschichtliches Bewusstsein. This means recognizing that the history of a text's influence is part of its meaning. We cannot stand outside of history to observe it objectively, we are always inside the stream of tradition. This realization challenges the Enlightenment ideal of the autonomous, rational subject who can judge everything from a neutral standpoint. Instead, it suggests our very ability to think is enabled by the historical linguistic community to which we belong. Being conscious of this historical effect allows us to be more critical of our assumptions while respecting the authority of tradition. Tradition is not a static burden but a living conversation. By acknowledging our historical situatedness, we gain a realistic sense of our limits, remembering that understanding is always a finite achievement grounded in a past that continues to speak to the present. Gadamer's hermeneutics has profoundly influenced theology, law, literary theory, and political philosophy. His emphasis on tradition and dialogue provided a powerful alternative to technical and scientific approaches. In theology, his work helped scholars understand how ancient texts speak to contemporary believers. In legal theory, his ideas about interpretation have been used to analyze how judges interpret law in changing social contexts. Furthermore, his debates with Jürgen Habermas and Jacques Derrida were major intellectual events that clarified the relationship between tradition, critique, and deconstruction. While some accused him of being too conservative, his focus on the openness of dialogue and the infinity of the unsaid has inspired many seeking to build bridges across cultural and ideological divides. Noam Chomsky. Is language an innate human faculty? Noam Chomsky is an American linguist and political theorist born in 1928. His 1957 book, Syntactic Structures, revolutionized linguistics by proposing that the capacity for language is an innate human faculty. He shifted the focus from describing specific languages to uncovering universal principles underlying all human speech. Beyond his scientific work, Chomsky is world-renowned for his radical critiques of American foreign policy and corporate power, notably in manufacturing consent. He has spent his career at MIT, becoming one of the most cited scholars in history. His dual career reflects a commitment to exploring the structures of human thought and systems of power. The speed with which children acquire language cannot be explained by simple imitation. This led to the hypothesis of universal grammar, an innate biological blueprint for language. This mental organ contains basic rules common to all human languages. Children do not learn the fundamental structure from scratch, they simply need exposure to data to set the switches for their specific environment. This concept shifted language study from the social sciences to cognitive psychology and biology, suggesting the mind is not a blank slate but pre-wired with structures that enable and constrain thought. By searching for these universal principles, we uncover the shared biological heritage of humanity. Universal grammar provides the foundation for our creative use of language, allowing us to produce and understand an infinite number of sentences we have never heard before. To study language scientifically, we must distinguish between underlying knowledge and actual use. Linguistic competence refers to the internalized system of rules that allows an ideal speaker-listener to understand an infinite range of sentences, the abstract knowledge of the language system. On the other hand, performance is the actual use of language in concrete situations, often flawed by stumbles or memory lapses. Chomsky argued that linguistics should focus on competence because performance is too influenced by non-linguistic factors to provide a clear picture of the mind's capabilities. This distinction allows researchers to build formal models of the mental structures that make communication possible, emphasizing that our mental capacity for language is far more sophisticated than our everyday speech might suggest. The sentences we speak often have a surface structure that can be deceptive. To explain how different sentences can mean the same thing, Chomsky's early influential models utilized the concept of deep structure and underlying syntactic level that determines the core meaning of a sentence before it is transformed into its surface form. Through a series of transformations, the mind converts these deep structures into the sentences we actually utter. This theory of transformational generative grammar reveals that language is a hierarchical system of relationships. This insight was revolutionary because it explained the underlying unity of human languages while accounting for their diversity. It suggests that while sounds and words vary, the logical engine that generates them follows universal principles. Understanding the relationship between deep and surface structures helps us appreciate the hidden complexity of our most basic human ability and the architecture of the human mind. Chomsky's impact on the intellectual landscape is unparalleled. In linguistics, the Chomskyan revolution shifted the field toward a cognitive and biological perspective, giving birth to modern biolinguistics. His work was a catalyst for the cognitive revolution in psychology, moving away from behaviorism toward internal mental processes. Beyond academia, his political writings have influenced generations of activists, providing a framework for analyzing how media and government shape public opinion. While some of his specific linguistic theories have been modified, the central idea of an innate, creative linguistic capacity remains a cornerstone of cognitive science. A fierce defender of reason and freedom, Chomsky remains a towering figure whose work continues to shape our understanding of what it means to be human.